Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm glad to see you all here. My name is Nora Rodriguez. I work at the Jewish Museum. I produce interpretive content. I'm so happy to be joined by John from Acoustic Guide and Claudia from Code and Theory. In July of this year, we launched a new mobile platform. And that's really just it's a single-page web application that is really primarily for people to access audio guide content, although we'll talk about some of the other content that's available there too. And that process of building that platform really coincided with a rethinking about about the content itself and our approach to creating that content and our approach to the voice that we wanted that content to have. So what we're going to be talking about today is those sort of two parallel evolutions, the evolution of the platform and then the evolution of the content. And I'm really happy to be joined by our two sort of partners in that journey. So I have the enviable position of kind of talking about the problem, and then you guys are going to talk about the solution. So before I jump in, I'm going to sort of set the table and tell you a little bit about where we were when we started this project. About a year before, or maybe about 6 months before we initiated the project, we had reinstalled our permanent collection. So if you heard us speak yesterday, you know that we sort of transitioned from working from a very linear story of Jewish history and Jewish culture to one that really mixes up contemporary art and Judaica, material culture, ritual culture, and fine art. And I think this is in line with what a lot of institutions are doing in terms of how they're thinking about showing the permanent stuff, and drawing some type of connections between things that might be sort of unusual. So for example, this is a painting by Kehinde Wiley next to a paper cut called a misra, which is sort of a ceremonial object. This actual paper cut was the inspiration for the background behind the painting. So thinking about, and actually it's in fact part of a triptych right next to these objects. There's a beautiful ornamental Torah arc, which also itself tells a story of migration and evolving visual culture. So, thinking about the permanent collection as an opportunity to draw these kind of unusual connections. The other thing that was happening at the same time, and I think a lot of us saw a slide that was similar to this yesterday, was some type of app fatigue for us. And up until this point, we had been creating a separate application for every single audio guide we were creating at the museum, which is pretty nuts. So if you were, for example, to go see 2 different shows, you would have to download 2 different apps to get audio guides for those shows, which was a nightmare for everyone. In 2009, Apple coined the term, there's an app for that, which is also the inspiration for the title of this talk. And so we were asking, what is happening to all those apps? I think it's not a surprise to most of us that are obsessively downloading apps when you visit a museum that you kind of download it once and then it sort of sits there and you don't use it again. 77% of users, or apps were losing 77% of their users within 3 days of downloading. We were finding that our visitor experience agents were spending all their time helping people reset their iTunes passwords as opposed to helping them understand, the content that was available for them. So we were thinking, how can we lower the barrier to entry? People didn't want to download an app because they didn't have enough room on their phones. So this is sort of the soup, the context in which we started, thinking about the barriers to visitors experiencing interpretive content. There were a few other challenges. So this is sort of the context in which we launched this. We had a new installation of the permanent collection. That permanent collection is asking us to think about interpretation a little bit differently. And also, I think, and you know, I will say that my role is a content producer, so you're getting this story from that perspective, right? And I think one of the big questions that came up for us is, you know, we are a institution that centers identity, although I would argue that all museums are identity institutions, or have identity at their center. So how do we sort of express some of that nuance and that complexity and that intersectionality in the collection, and even go deeper in the interpretive content? We had some sense of app fatigue. And then the last thing that I have yet to mention is a very specific operational challenge, which is that at the Jewish Museum, we do not hand out devices. We do not exchange money on the Sabbath, which is Saturday. We have free admission on Saturdays, which actually happens to be our highest day of visitation. So this also means that we do not give out devices or audio guide devices. So this was an added layer of complexity. And we sort of affectionately have called our solution a hacking of the Sabbath. So that sort of is where we start the story, where our story begins. So what do we set out to do? You know, I've mentioned this desire to, you know, surface diverse perspectives. I think that is particularly important at an institution like a Jewish museum, where people come in with some vision of what it means to be Jewish. So we went in really hoping to like broaden the voices that we were surfacing in our content. You know, when I started this, and I guess I'll just back up and say, when I talk about goals, I think for us there was a what do we want to say, and then there was a how do we want to say it. And I don't think that cuts quite evenly as content and technology, but I think that you'll see some of that there. So second goal, reveal deep stories. I mean, storytelling is like the buzzword of 2016, I don't know, but, and it's my favorite buzzword, I have to say, but I found that as soon as I got to the museum, and I actually was hired just after this process started, you know, everyone was saying to me, we want to tell deep stories. And in my experience, people have very different ideas about what that means and what a story is. So a big part of this process was talking to people about what we mean when we mean storytelling. And I think that'll come up a little bit more in the content piece. And then the last goal was this idea of forging connections not only between artworks, and helping people circulate and make connections between exhibitions, but also make connections between, Jewish history, Jewish experience, Jewish values, whatever that means, and values that are held between people that don't have an experience with Judaism. Okay, the how. So how did we want to communicate? Well, we knew that we needed something that was sustainable. So something that, we don't have an in-house developer, so something that could be pretty flexible and evolve with us. And also, something that I think we're really seeing now is our content strategy is evolving, and we're asking, how does that impact the design of the platform? And we wanted something that would be fairly flexible to change with us. Okay, great. So that was the problem. We had so many, or not the problem, the challenge. There are so many challenges. And so now at this point, I get to hand it over to Claudia, who came in and saved us. Yeah.
No pressure. Do I have to stand up?
I'm going to sit down. Okay. I don't know why.
Oh, is this not on?
Is it on?
Yeah, we'll do.
Okay.
It's on?
You're fine.
Great. So I'm Claudia Bershami. I'm design director at Code and Theory San Francisco, and I'm here to provide a little insight from a design perspective around how we really tried to reimagine the mobile tour experience for the Jewish Museum, given those set of challenges. So initially, the task was conceive a compelling and flexible digital execution. As Nora mentioned, they were reinstalling the permanent collection. So to accompany that and really drive visitor engagement with the Jewish Museum and the artworks. So we framed our approach around these 5 fundamentals. So visitor engagement, we wanted to focus on really enhancing the in-museum experience when you're on site. So you shouldn't be glued to your phone. You shouldn't have to be to find the content you need. It should be a seamless extension of the physical experience. Holistic collections, we wanted to forge those connections, as Nora mentioned, between not only exhibitions but their permanent collections, so people can draw those connections, keep circulating, thanks to the flexible architecture and implementation as an Angular single-page application, in the interest of just compatibility and accessibility across platforms and devices, especially in consideration of the Sabbath and those limitations. That was our approach, and it had a headless CMS really running it so that content authors could really follow a post once, publish everywhere model, making the content very easy to manage and evolve over time. And based on the data that we're getting, we've had the opportunity to have a continued relationship and make some focused updates to the experience. So not only in terms of the front-end design, but also just how we path users and just considering what's the information that they're trying to find and what functionality are they really trying to use when they're interacting with this app experience. And lastly, Jewish identity and just extending the goals of the Jewish Museum into the tools they use to communicate with their audience and making sure everything felt on brand, intuitive, and accessible. Through the lens of those 5 fundamentals, we created a key set of features. So around guided tours, not only did we want the Jewish Museum to be able to surface these stories and themes, whether it be kids' collections or more around Judaism, very seamlessly, but we wanted people to be able to find single artworks very easily. And in the way that it's organized is every artwork has a numerical code associated with it. And that could have several layers of media, supplemental media associated with it therein. So having that be easily surfaced within the application when you're on site, and also when you're off site, having that be a very visually driven experience where related content is surfaced through related taxonomy, and so people continuously pass. So you're never finishing a tour and kind of like, now what? So just continuously ensuring that related content and themes are surfaced. So fast. The solution ultimately, and this is kind of TLDR, but our solution was just to conceive a dynamic companion-style mobile tour experience, one that really served to guide users through the artworks when they're in person, but also seamlessly extend itself off-site. So making sure that we could, that actually gave us the opportunity, I should say, to really extend the reach and impact of this exclusive content, because there's a lot of content in the works, from artists and poets and writers to just interesting people like rabbis that really provide additional context and history and stories behind these artworks. So making sure that that's very easily accessible. And our technical build allows for content editors to just manage that content over time as the organizational goals evolve. So as you can see here, mobile first was very much the focus. Initially, we wanted to just ground users in the present moment when they're in the museum. Shouldn't be glued to their phone. It's about your in-person experience. We wanted everything to be very accessible, so not only extending the very strong branding that Jewish Museum already has in play into this very utility-driven moment, but also making sure that the visuals and the artworks could take center stage and that the UI was minimal and not cumbersome and not competing with that. So visual first, and then just in our motion paradigms and the choices we made in layout, making sure that everything was very swipeable, clickable. There's a very broad range in the demographic in terms of age, so making sure that things were very inclusive in terms of that as well. And so nothing was hard to use and everything was intuitive. Even considering the floor plan motion, how that echoes the carousels, so just making sure that that's consistent throughout the experience. And also, as you can see in the second screen, it's just a guided tour. We test edge cases. We wanted to make sure that this was bulletproof across all responsively across all viewports, because people could access this web app through anywhere, and that was the goal. So just continued exploration and engagement with this content on or off site.
Oh, we have a video now, so we'll give you a little trailer. Was there anything else you wanted to say before we?
No, I mean, I'm sure things will come up in questions.
Okay, great. So let's watch a quick. Stakes are high. Okay.
I'll hand it
Thank
over
you.
to
No.
John.
I'll let John take it from
And I will not be standing either.
here.
Dear is right. Jeez. So John Simonello, I'm executive producer at Acoustic Guide, and starting off, we have a long history with the Jewish Museum. We've been producing content for them for a very long time, a lot of relationships, very important partner for us that we value a ton. So when we walk into a meeting, they're like, we're kind of moving away from audio tours. We said, cool, that's fine. Audio tours are totally, where those are so yesterday. That we actually do experiences, and that's kind of what they're looking for. Is they're reinventing the visitor experience, or reinventing or rethinking the way that visitors are interacting with objects, with content, with stories, everything. So it's been really good. It was a really good. It's a really good way to start the conversation. So we started it with, where should we start? And the first sort of things that came up were moving away from tours, moving into shorter audio content collections. So rather than a 20-stop tour, 20-object tour, we're talking about 5, maybe 10. A much more modular approach where you have smaller groups that are speaking to certain things, whether it's themes or whatever else. We'll get into that in a minute. Crossover, whether it's one object with multiple points of view crossing over, or the ability to cross over between objects in different galleries, in different exhibitions, in different themes. So that idea of like being kind of like Claudia was talking about, being able to sort of segue. There's never an end. There's a segue from one thing to another. And there's some sort of interrelatedness. There's this connected feeling. And then obviously we left it open for many more things to come as the conversations continued. So change, we talked about changing a lot for months. What were the changes? What could we change? It was a lot of brainstorming. We would go in thinking, okay, this is when we're going to start. This is our starting point. And then we'd walk away after 2 hours of conversation going, nope, not yet. So it was a lot of steps. And then all of a sudden, everybody was jumping in with both feet and really into the deep end of the pool and a lot of times. Honestly. So, so the first thing one of the things we talked about was creating thematic groups. And that, even the definition of what a thematic tour or thematic content selection would be, really trying to move away from the term tour, was difficult. It's hard. It's really hard to define. There's very broad themes that we talked about, and to some degree, I think we're successful in creating sort of thematic containers that we put certain pieces of content into.
Can I jump in here also
Sure.
just to clarify? I also think, what I brought up in the beginning is this redesign or reinstallation of our permanent collection, and I think that desire for a thematic tour really came out of feedback from visitors. So this, what had formerly really been a very clear linear path now felt, I think, much more dispersed. Or like what we heard from visitors is that they wanted a story. And so these thematic tours were a way of sort of carving a pathway for visitors based on a theme such as Jewish ritual or migration or queer identity, so that visitors could sort of choose a lens through which to travel through the permanent collection.
Right. And one of the things that came up is like we talked about, is that they're sort of like why it says thoughtful and foundational is that we were thinking about what were these themes, but they are foundational to the museum, to their goals, to the stories they want to tell, and especially with the reinstall, it was completely different, and it's kind of difficult. It might be difficult or a little bit confusing to understand what the point of each of the collections is, or each of the exhibition spaces is, without a little something to sort of give you some connections. So all of that kind of came into play, and so like when I said that it was difficult to define themes or to actually create these themes, I think that was why we had a lot of goals in what we were thinking about in terms of reinventing or evolving the content. So in terms of a little bit of the working process, we had a sort of a less traditional sound. Like the Jewish Museum, as Nora said, had a very traditional set of, very traditional permanent collection exhibition and very traditional audio tour, and this was not going to be that. This was going to be different. It led to a different format, different sound. Like I said, smaller tour containers, sort of. The scripting changes, we decided to lean a lot more heavily on interviews, on voices outside of the museum. We were really interested in different points of view rather than the usual curatorial point of view, and really leaning on what people were saying and sort of just giving that a platform in our scripts, rather than sort of the traditional, here's a curator telling you this point that you may have heard before. And then also we're really working on defining the museum's voice, giving them a voice that reflected what their new goals were with the new installation, with sort of their mission, with this sort of idea of, as Nora mentioned, the idea of it's the Jewish museum, but they're an art museum as well. It's not strictly Judaica. There's a lot going on there, and that voice is a very complex voice, and it's a diverse voice, and that's one of the things we're really working on. That included a style shift, which was much more, like I said, conversational, leaning on these interviews. A lot of different points of view, which was really fun. If you came to the presentation that Nora and I did yesterday, you got to hear the kids' point of view, which was like I spent 4 evenings or late afternoons from 2 or 3 hours apiece with 8 or 10 fifth grade girls who had a lot to say, and it was like some of the stuff that they come up with, I really don't know where it came from, but it was amazing. So, and then finally, there's talk of being irreverent. We try, and then we sometimes get some pushback. So it's trying to break out of the mold a little bit. Yeah. So that crossover that we talked about, multiple points of view. So within any specific object, you can hear kids talk about it, you can hear an artist talk about it, you can hear a voice from the community talk about it, and really give you just different ways of really approaching these objects. And makes them really come alive. It's not just the object anymore. There's a story, there's a history, there's a personal connection, and it's all things that it goes really beyond just, here's this object, here's what it means. Here's what it means to me, and here's something that's real, maybe you haven't thought about before. And if you are not Jewish and have no idea what some of these objects are or what they mean, it really gives such an emotional resonance that it's been really interesting for me. I am not Jewish, so there's a lot of things I learned, and it's been really great. Also, then the connection between objects, being able to put objects together within a specific thematic tour, really sort of connects things that maybe otherwise wouldn't have been connected. And then, as I mentioned, a lot of voices, those diverse voices. We had there's an artist, there's a bunch of artists tours, artists who talk about objects that aren't their objects, they're objects that they're reacting to. So it's a different point of view, and it may not be a Jewish point of view, it may just be a point of view of how does this speak to me. As I mentioned, the young people, and if you haven't heard that tour, just go listen to a couple of them, they're amazing. Community voices, whether it's rabbis or other people in the community who also have really interesting personal stories, personal histories, and what things meant to them throughout their life. The diversity was that's been one of the keys. And then accessibility, for one thing, verbal description we've been working on, which is not something that we had done before with the Jewish Museum. And then also you'll show some ASL video later on.
A couple things.
Yeah.
Hopper.
So, yeah, the question was how to make it work. And as I mentioned, it was sort of a stuttering start that then just exploded. And I think we were working at one point on like 5 different projects at once or something, among various people, not just me, but Julie Truman and some other people at Acoustic Guide. So, as I mentioned, shorter modules. So, I don't think we've with the exception of so one sort of caveat is the temporary exhibitions are staying semi-traditional in the sense that they're 20-ish stops, the same kind of idea that you would do with a temporary show. But for things that are more of the thematic or the artist voices or something, those are generally shorter, probably no more than 10 or 15 tops. And we would only work on like 5 or 6 at a time so that we could really concentrate on them, really make them have them come to life and really be something that was special and different from what we've been doing. Definitely a shorter production timeline, and that's manageable because there's fewer, but we were crushing through we had to crush through some of these really quickly. As soon as the platform was finally ready, we were just like, bam, we got to get these in there. It's probably for the best because I tend to be someone who I would work on something forever and still not be happy with it. So in this case, like, we didn't have a choice, and we were just like, okay, it's completely new. We're just going to like get in there and record, and then we're going to make it, and then it's done. And it's out there. Increased production value. In the past, the Jewish Museum had like some music, a little bit of this in their tours. This, we've really bumped it up, and we've really sort of made the pieces much more immersive, much more, as people in our company like to say, experiential, that sort of are much more enveloping and much more. It creates a different sense when you're listening to this and experiencing the object at the same time and hearing this intense story with just enough production value that you don't notice it, but it really enhances the experience. And of course, it all comes down to the storytelling that we're doing, and I think we've been really, because the Jewish Museum has a lot of voices that they can mine, and they have some amazing things to say, we've really been able to make compelling content. And when there have been cases where we've worked on things or we've recorded things, and it's just not been that compelling, and we know that, and we elect to not prioritize that. So really making the things that are compelling and only putting those things out there, I think, has been really important. And then those last two things are pretty self-evident. Like, we've been, like, I said this to Nora the other day, and I meant it. Like, this has been a partnership, and it's been an interesting experience because it broke our mold a little bit in the terms of the way we work. I mean, we create a lot of content, so there's a necessity in a certain level for us to have a method of working. But in this case, like, partnering specifically with Nora, we talk way too much. Like, Nora is my friend now. Nora has seen me do weird things that I know other people have never seen, probably, with very few exceptions. But the fact is that it's because of that there has been a real collaboration that's been made that's enabled this creation of a different breed of content for this museum, and then being able to be delivered in a different way, I think, is also it's made it so that kind of like Claudia was saying, being able to surface things that people might not otherwise experience, and it's a lot of content in a certain way, and if it's not presented in the right way, I think it wouldn't work. But I think the sort of synergistic way in which the content and the delivery have come together has been really, it's been good. I've been very happy about it.
I'm so glad. So I think actually we're gonna take a look at the platform and then listen to a couple things. But I think I'm glad you brought up the quantity of content, because I think that has been like a real question for us recently, and we'll get into that a little bit when we talk about kind of like where we're at now and lessons learned and all those things. So, do you want to say anything? No, you.
No, I was thinking about when I was actually in the physical space, how the walls are not permanent. A lot of the installations, exhibitions, that was a challenge in terms of design. We couldn't just in how we treated instructions to get to the next step, and making sure that was very clear, since users could be bouncing from room to room, and things do shift over time with different exhibitions. So that was an interesting design challenge. And as John mentioned, when you're in the space with such history, you could love art, but you may not know as much about an artist, and so having that ability to dive deeper without feeling bogged down by the device was really the key focus when you're in person. But having that extend seamlessly to when you are just looking to get into this kind of like wormhole of inspiration and discovery, and how that plays out offsite.
So here's our mobile platform. I think it's pretty standard in that you have a search function, you have a tours function. Who remembers the object I was going to pull up? This is nope, it's 344. So you can see that actually, let me go back for a second. That there's sort of these layers of audio that are available that come up right on search, and you can click on Learn More and see more about the object and see which tours it's a part of. Like we said, we have these kind of different intersecting pathways, so an object might exist on multiple tours. This object is a nice example because you have a layer that is a rabbi. It's a real authority figure talking about what is this thing called Hanukkah, and then we also have a tour or a track that's part of our series called Artist Voices, which is artists speaking about artworks. And here we have a video by Douglas Ridloff, who's a pretty remarkable deaf poet who performs with movement in ASL. So I think we're going to play just a little clip. And I, earlier I brought up this concept of storytelling and what it is to tell a story, and that really different people, a curator's idea of what a story is tends, in my experience, to be often very different than what someone in the education department or someone in the marketing department means when they say the word story. But I'm hopeful that we're kind of able to capture these different facets of storytelling. So you might have some idea of what a rabbi's sense of story is. Here is Alex and Myra Kalman, who are artists. Myra did a mural in Russ and Daughters at the Jewish Museum, and so here they are talking about Hanukkah in their home.
So now we're in the room of the menorahs, the menorot. And I have a very strong response because we're a secular-ish family that has roots in a very observant family that was once kosher and observed the Sabbath, and then little by little it fell away.
That's Myra Kalman, an artist and illustrator, with her son, Alex Kalman, a designer, curator, and writer.
But we observe the holidays, and Hanukkah is a big one, of course, and it's a very festive one. But we're an incredibly impatient family and don't like to follow rules, so we light as many menorahs as we can with all the candles the first night. My feeling is the more the better. Let there be light, let there be festivities, lots and lots of latkes and lots of people.
The Jewish Museum's collection of Hanukkah lamps is the largest in the world at just over 1,000 pieces. This installation contains over 80 examples from that collection, organized by their materials.
We would make menorahs out of fruit. Is that right?
Like oranges and lemons and, cutting, just everything we had around the house that could be a menorah. Potatoes. Remember the potato menorahs? Look, he's looking at me like, what are you talking about?
Of course I remember them.
And I guess that way we didn't have to give you presents every night, which is absurd.
That I remember.
You remember not getting presents.
What is the story of Hanukkah exactly?
Well, legend has it that Judah and the Maccabees were somewhere. Where were they? They were somewhere, and they didn't have enough something.
Oil?
Oh my God, that's right. They didn't have enough oil to light the lights.
The lights, to see.
And there was a miracle, and there was enough light for 8 nights.
Well, the nice thing is that elements from the traditions stay a part of your experiences now. You might not know the historical relevance, but you create your own meaning and your own sense of joy through it. So perhaps you don't know why the menorah exists exactly, but it is still a source of happiness and poignancy in your life.
You can hear more about Hanukkah on our Jewish Rituals audio tour.
Alex really brought it home for us in the end. So I don't know, maybe you're not surprised by this, but that track, there was some conversation internally about whether we could have a track like that.
That's the irreverent part.
Right, that's the irreverent part, and and about whether like not knowing the story of Hanukkah is a way of being Jewish, which of course it is. That like feeling some type of connection, but also alienation from your culture is obviously not unique to being Jewish, but also is a part of being sort of like an assimilated Jewish person in this country. But I honestly think that track could only exist with to hear more about Jewish rituals. Tap the next track line at the end. So having these kind of different layers and different like facets, or different ways of telling a story, I think sort of like gives space for a little bit of lightness and humor. And I think often there's like this real, attachment to like if we only have one chance to tell this story, and so it has to be perfect, and we need to give people all of the information. So from there, I guess we'll talk about what's next. And about how things have sort of like evolved through this process. So updates to the platform. Do you want to talk about this, or do you want me to talk about this? It's
kind of in the works, so you can
yeah. Sure. So, I definitely, there's a lot of things that feel so obvious now that I think that weren't, that have sort of surfaced for us in this process. I mean, the biggest one is that we really built this platform to do one thing really well, which is to serve audio content. We have started developing a lot more ASL videos, and not only ASL videos, but also working with deaf artists and asking them to sort of like produce content that is like a part of their work and a part of their practice. The platform is really, I think, has some growth, in terms of how we're surfacing that video content. So for example, if you were looking closely, you saw that, even an object that has video associated with it won't have video come up as part of the search results.
Right. I think that our initial goal was really focused on enhancing that museum experience, and we were shying away from trying to do too much as a true app would maybe offer. And I've been to other nameless museums where I feel like I am looking around, or like sitting on a bench at some points trying to interact and find the next thing, and looking around and seeing similar experiences around me. And so we were really sensitive to that, and we did our due diligence and went around and experienced other mobile tour experiences in order to kind of have the most informed opinion moving forward. And of course the data is informing some of these targeted fixes, and we don't want to bury some of this rich content, and the more content that is being developed, I think is pushing more towards surfacing that even from the get-go at the point where you're entering a numeric code and searching for artwork. So in the view, when we were listening to the content there, that was a detail page, and that has a very flexible layout too, where you could provide much longer content and insight around substrates and process and artist insight and history, as well as related content and pathing. And so finding the right way based on how people are interacting with the app to maybe surface the video even at a higher level. And this is something that I think we're adding in piece by piece, and testing and reevaluating, so that we're sensitive to kind of just bogging people down and gluing you to your phone. And you should, and all choices are made with that consideration of extending it seamlessly off-site. So if you are in a position where you are just trying to get inspiration and dive deeper, it should feel very consistent and very easy to do as well.
I'll speak a little bit to the evolution of the content too. Yeah, I'll let you know. So I think that one thing that really came out for us, we initiated this series called Artist Voices, which I know a lot of art museums do, which is, interview artists talking about both their own work and other works on view. And I think that what really came up for us is that when someone is speaking, is sort of given agency to choose works and talk about what is most interesting to them. It really, and maybe even bring along a friend, bring along your son or your parent or someone else that you can kind of engage in conversation. It just yields something that's sort of magical and can't be scripted. And so we've been trying out sort of extending this model beyond artists and just inviting other people whose voices we want to hear. I think another thing, it's funny because that Kalman track is something that we did really early in the process, and it was actually sort of jarring for me to hear the narrator voice. We have been trying to move away from scripted narration, and whenever possible, I mean, my real personal goal is to name every single voice that you hear, so that you always know whose voice it is, even if it's a museum staff member that we're using as a narrator to say, you know, hi, my name is Nora Rodriguez. I work in the shop, or I work in security, and
That's something I forgot to mention. That one of the things, for our newer tours, we have moved away from professional narrators altogether. We've been using in museum, like people from the museum are their narrators, and it's not always a curator. It could be an educator. It could be somebody else. That's part of that whole defining the museum voice. It's no longer a professional, polished voice. It's the museum's voice, literally.
Yeah, a lot of voices.
A lot of voices.
But, you know, that has also necessitated, like, some real changes in how we think about our process. And I guess the other thing I would say is that, you know, we started this process saying we wanted these diverse voices, and I still think that's very important. I think that what we're continuing to think about is not only a diversity of voices, but thinking about intersectionality of voice, so asking people to think about their Jewish identity and how it overlaps with other facets of their identity, their language, their national origin, their gender, their sexuality, their race, and actually to really make that quite explicit in how we approach them, to be a part of an audio guide. And so that's been exciting, and I'm excited to see sort of how that evolves. So that's sort of a little bit about where we are in the process. I think we're still, I mean, you know, this has been launched for how many months? 5 months? July, August. A few months. And so I think we're like still, it's certainly the process isn't over. We're still really thinking about what's next. So I'll end there and see if there are any questions. We do have some initial analytics, although I didn't bring a slide that has any specific numbers that I can share. So if there's anything specific you're curious about, I'm happy to let you know, or maybe we could talk after the fact. You know, our pickup rate initially was pretty high. People at the Jewish Museum quite like audio guides. It was around 18%, and we've seen kind of a small uptick, although one of the funny things is that we launched with a sort of 2-level special exhibition that had no audio guide. It was the Leonard Cohen exhibition, so it sort of was an audio guide in and of itself. So it's only been really in the last month that we've had a special exhibition audio guide. So we've been sort of holding off on trying to draw too many conclusions from our analytics because it's been sort of a weird time for the museum when really the only audio that's been available is permanent collection audio. And the other question you asked was how we've made it, how we've marketed it. So it's mostly been through social, the website, and then, you know, signage on site. We haven't done any type of like audio specific advertising campaigns. So
Can you mention, like, what's because I don't know this, but the own device versus the devices you have on site?
like what percentage are taking?
Or yeah, or just like how does that interact in that sort of scenario? So they just to explain, yeah. So obviously you can use your own device, but they also do have a fleet of devices on site that like that's what our traditionally had been doing with them. But they have a fleet of smart devices on site that users or visitors can use to access the content if they don't want to use their own device or don't have a device.
Yeah, that's a great point. And actually, I know this has come up in other sessions. I mean, it still is looking like the majority of people want to take out a device. It's something around, it looks like it's around 60 to 70% are actually taking devices out, even though it is available on your phone, which is interesting and, yeah, something for us to think about. Other questions? Claudia, you did such a good job of calling. I think you should be the question.
Back there?
Yeah, I wondered about the decision to use number codes for the individual artwork rather than QR codes or some other technology. And my other question was, I didn't catch it, but I'm really interested in this unique challenge you have that on Sabbath you're not going to be renting out devices. What is your alternative offering? I'm sorry if I missed it and you were describing it. Or is there no alternative offering? Right. Well, the alternative is that the visitor experience agents offer that people can take the tour on their own phones. So it's just a website that they would visit.
Yeah, it's a web application, so it's accessible anywhere, even desktop computers. So it would just be a matter of social sign into Wi-Fi, right? Or just local Wi-Fi. And that enables, I mean, as long as you have internet connection, that would be the alternative and the workaround. In terms of the numerical code, that was in play before we came into the picture.
Yeah, that's a decision that predated me.
I think we had just aligned on, making it a consistent 3 code because there was a lot of variety of systems, and the numbers kind of varied. I think it was 3 and 4 at the time, but now I think it's only 3. And I think our added layer has just been associating that content with those numerical codes and extending that to digital, but that was already in play. Go ahead. Yeah, sure, go ahead.
I was just curious, with the greater use of personal devices, were you doing any sort of infrastructure changes, like using up your Wi-Fi, adding charging stations, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, that's a really great question because I sort of skimmed over that. And this project really was initiated in tandem with a huge overhaul of our Wi-Fi. So we totally sort of revamped the Wi-Fi system. And we've only actually, in the last month, we have added charging stations in the lobby and in sort of like the entrance to the some of the special exhibitions.
That kind of related to our challenge around the shifting walls, essentially, because we were thinking of beacons and having that be integrated into the directions that we were giving, but that we scaled back to make it much more flexible to have just the text in the audio, the instructions in the audio as part of that content sometimes, versus relying on that kind of a thing because of the shifting nature of the layout. So it was definitely a consideration to inform that. You also had your hand up.
You referenced that you're using a headless CMS and you're creating a lot of content. Are there plans to kind of make that available across platforms? Is your CMS kind of powering other things? Like, are there ways people will get access to that content besides, like, if they know the audio guide is there?
You mean off-site in general?
I'm curious if you're kind of using your headless CMS to start to service that content on your general website or across other kind of locations or platforms.
It hasn't been done yet from our end. I mean, right now, it's still just within the web app experience. But I think, I don't know if as an organization you want to, it's definitely still on the main homepage URL as just like an extension of that. In terms of, I don't know, is that more of like a content question if you're going to fold that into the website more?
Yeah, it is folded in to some degree. So if you are searching the collection through just our general webpage and you've come upon an object that has audio content associated with it, you can listen to it just through the general webpage. And of course, everything's available on SoundCloud. But beyond that, I don't know that there's, and then of course, yeah.
The vision with approaching it that way was to allow for that flexibility, but I don't know if it's been implemented yet as such. Great idea, though. Yes.
Just to follow up on that, my question is similar. I work in an organization with 21 apps, and all of the content was apps are held hostage
Exactly, right.
Yes.
I was wondering about the decision initially to turn this idea of, being able to tell stories about each object. Why was that put into an app, like that the person would view, as opposed to like a kiosk or a button or a speaker? And also related to that, how does it work when multiple people are at the same object, and people, are they on their speaker phones, or do they hear each other over the, like, what does that look like in the physical space?
I mean, I think, well, for the choice around making it not a kiosk, I think it's not off the table if there's a special exhibition, I'd imagine, but I think that was just an accessibility to the information kind of a thing. We wanted that to be available off-site, and that became a goal after the kickoff of the project, but it definitely happened before the design phase kicked off, so that we were focusing our layout and design choices to make the experience, although more focused on enhancing that in-museum experience, but not dependent on being on site. So I think that was the choice around moving away from site-dependent things like that. In terms of the speakerphone versus headphones, I don't know if you have more insight into how people are using that and how that's going.
Yeah, well, we require people to use headphones in the galleries, so that's sort of like the easy response there. And I would also just add that I think that generally the Jewish Museum, aims to kind of keep technology pretty light in the galleries, so that it feels like there aren't a lot of sort of screens or kind of like machinery in this space that is sort of mediating your interaction with the artworks. So I think that was part of the goal with just having, and because it is a lot of content, having something that was just sort of on a mobile device.
Yes.
I was just wondering, because you mentioned you require visitors to use headphones in the gallery, so for visitors who are bringing their own devices, do you have headphones available on site for people to use?
Yes. Yeah. We give headphones that people can keep, and then we have kind of larger headphones that are available for rental.
What are the mobile devices that you provide?
Yeah, great question, because I actually feel like this has been something that we're kind of evolving on. Currently, we provide iPod Touches. I think that the biggest challenge there is that the screens do not feel large enough. And so we're looking into just some devices that have larger screens, or even just providing iPads, because, I mean, yeah, even for me, I find the text hard to read.
That was a consideration too when using your own device, since the age range was so broad. You know that, I mean, I look over at my relatives and they have the zoom level and the type size very macro, very zoomed in and large. So I feel like that is something specific to your device and how, you know, you need to have your settings. And so that was a benefit of allowing the experience to extend to your own device seamlessly. However, if the use case seems to be such that people still want to use these other, you know, these devices that are provided, so that's interesting to note. But the whole idea was to provide that, you know, so that it could feel already set up to how you need to experience it. Yes.
So you guys mentioned that you guys are introducing multiple new voices. It's not just the same voice that you have been providing in previous audio experiences. And we've actually tried that at our museum, and we found that we've actually had some pushback because people don't really trust some of these new voices. They're not really sure. So how are you guys like introducing the new voices and kind of building that kind of trust in these new points of view, as you know, or have you guys had any pushback on that?
Yeah, that's interesting. We did a little bit of evaluation at the outset, and we definitely did hear from people that they wanted to hear experts, curators. And I think that one response is to kind of have both, is to so that people, if they really want to hear that kind of expert voice, they can hear that, and then we also have sort of this more like irreverent, light voice that can kind of,
I mean, kind of like at the end of that track where they were like, now listen to the, you know, you can hear the rabbi tell you like the legit story, and like that's kind of, I think that's kind of the way and that's that whole thing of being able to provide a diversity of voices about one object. It's not just like, okay, we're eschewing, like we're just, all of you experts go away, we don't want to hear from you anymore, and it's not like it's crowdsourced or anything like that. It's more, what's a different point of view and adding a point of view. I think it's more additive than it is replacing.
But you guys, I mean, in the example you showed, you kept those two tracks kind of separate, right? So is that the plan, is to keep each point of view as a separate kind of experience? So that way, if you want the classical expert, very to the point, it's here, and if you want the irreverent one, it's here, and if maybe you want like this one, it's here.
I mean, I don't know that, I don't think there's any rules right now. No rules. So yeah, I think it's more, I think that is the case right now because that's the way it's sort of shaken out. I don't see that as being the only way we would do it now. Like I do see like it would be awesome to have an expert and an irreverent voice talking to each other, like, and had juxtapose them. I would be all over that. So I think that there's a lot of ways we can handle it, and I think that's kind of the awesome part of the way the platform is like it gives you all this flexibility to be able to present different points of view in different ways, and whether it's two different tracks or one track or, who knows.
But from a
Claudia can make something magic happen.
From a design perspective, that was just in terms of kind of optimizing the experience. I think that we didn't want autoplay and to just kind of take you right into the next one. We wanted to provide the opportunity to have the instructions and consideration of how layout changes and how that could evolve. We didn't want users to ever be in a position where they're scrambling, they're confused, and they don't know where they need to be or where the next art piece is, and it's already playing. So that was the logic around distinct tracks from that perspective, to keep that consistent, because that's the way the audio tours is currently implemented as well. So keeping that artwork detail view where the supplemental audio and video is presented as such, keeping that in line with the tours and how that's kind of distinct tracks.
I'm interested in how you develop the content and develop the platform, like what the timeline looked at. Like, did you start thinking about content first?
Went like
and then
this.
or all at once?
Very agile, very
A lot of
overlap.
flailing.
Yeah.
Close collaboration. I think we
It
had
was-
some parameters for content and what they were cooking up, and we framed our approach and adjusted our approach accordingly. And decisions like the continuous play and like how to present instructions and how the tone, should that be text, should that be audio as well, and that balance was kind of things that shifted and evolved throughout the course of the project, and that's kind of, so it was all happening sort of, in overlapped kind of process.
Like for instance, like we were on their base camp for this project, so I would all of a sudden get a whole set of new screenshots and be like, oh, that's how it's gonna work. So, and it would adjust the way we thought about it. And honestly, in terms of the content, it didn't necessarily affect us that much unless we were doing things where we need to make sure, like, think about how the crossover was happening, like being able to give verbal cues or anything like that.
You talked earlier about how you wanted to make shorter, more modular tours. I was wondering what you do about people who go into the museum and don't really know what they're interested in. How do you float certain things, recommendations or whatever, to visitors who don't know how to shoot people?
From a design perspective, we really facilitated this kind of choose your own adventure experience too. So whereas things are curated as tours, it's very easy to jump around, and also the way the UI works is like it has your last played item still queued up, so that if you do, digress out from the tour, you won't be thrown if you do want to jump back in. But from a design perspective, you could easily bounce around, and that kind of exploratory nature was encouraged. And in terms of that was from a design perspective.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I actually feel like it's something that we're really actively thinking about, because whereas for special exhibitions, there's typically two audio guides. There's a audio guide led by maybe a curator, and then there's often a verbal description audio guide. Whereas for this permanent collection, we now sort of have this real wealth of content and many different audio tours, which is really unusual. You go to you think of going to a show and there's one audio guide. So kind of how do we communicate that? And I think that we're really actively thinking about that in in the platform. You saw that there's sort of like a tours section, and then we have this section that's called Artist Voices, which is really just more audio tours, you know, that are led by an artist. But I think, honestly, we're still in really active conversation about how to name those sections. Do we want different sections? Do we want a permanent collection section? And then also, you know, there's an element of onboarding, but of course, you know, we don't want to place too much of a burden on the visitor experience agents to kind of talk someone through the platform. So
Yeah, I do feel like there's a bit of a serendipitous nature to it all. Like, you find stuff because you end up someplace and, like, kind of like what Claudia was saying, is like you'll listen to a track and you're like, oh, what's this other track with it, which could lead you to something else completely, and you're suddenly off your tour, but you're pretty psyched because it's kind of interesting. So, you know, I think it's a win-win. Like, it's just yeah. Those modular pieces sort of fit together in different ways. They're like Legos or something. I don't know.
cool. So I think that we are out of time, but thank you all so much.